Hi and welcome to my OCR A-Level Biology revision lesson with me, Christine. So in today's lesson, I'm going to look at water, which is part of your biological molecules topic in Module 2. So if we look at water then and we understand water, water is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. That's why it's called H2O. Well, now I'm going to take you back to your GCSE knowledge and talk about the types of bonds that are holding these 3 atoms together. So because we have non-metals being held together, we know that they are covalently bonded. And because they're covalently bonded, that tells us that they are sharing their electrons. Well, when we look at a water molecule, we actually note that there's an uneven sharing of electrons. What that means is that the electrons spend more time closer to one atom than another. And in this case, the electrons spend more time at the oxygen atom than they do at the hydrogen atom. And what that does is that results in a region which is slightly more negative towards the oxygen end and another region which is slightly more positive towards the hydrogen end. That therefore means that we call this a polar molecule. So what water is actually made up of is 2 hydroxyl groups. So a hydroxyl group is where there is an oxygen and a hydrogen, and you see that uneven sharing of the electrons. So we show that in a diagram as a delta positive sign at the hydrogen end and a delta negative side at the oxygen end. So if we have 2 water molecules coming together, then what we find is because of this polarity, because there is a positive end and a negative end, they form what's known as hydrogen bonds. Now, hydrogen bonds between the water molecules make them attracted to one another, and so they move together, and that's what's known as the cohesive property of water. Now, hydrogen bonds are weak interactions. They are breaking and reforming constantly. But what's really important is that we note that water doesn't stay on its own. Water is made up of lots of water molecules, so therefore there is a large number of bonds. So water is normally liquid at a room temperature, and because there are these large number of bonds, we say that water is collectively strong. That body of water, if we're looking at the ocean or we're looking at a pot of water, because there are a large number of these hydrogen bonds, that makes it collectively strong. So what we say is that water has a high specific heat capacity. The energy that is needed to increase the temperature by 1 degree C is what is known as its high specific heat capacity. And that therefore makes the water a very stable environment. Now, not only is it a stable environment, but it also has what's known as a high latent heat of vaporization. The high latent heat of vaporization is about the energy required to break those hydrogen bonds so that it can be changed from the liquid state into the gaseous state, which is water vapor. So there's a lot of energy that's needed to break those bonds. So when that energy breaks the bonds, those hydrogen bonds, that therefore means that that takes the energy out into the atmosphere and has a cooling effect. That cooling effect is on the plant or on the animal if they are turning the water, the liquid, into the vapor, the gaseous state. So not only does it have this high specific heat capacity and this high latent heat of vaporization, there's also the high latent heat of fusion. So this is that it's a lot of energy needs to be lost so that the liquid can be turned into the solid state. So there's lots of energy needed to actually freeze that water. So what we're doing therefore is we're actually fixing those positions of those hydrogen bonds. Now, ice therefore, that solid state of water, is less dense than the water, the liquid state, and so will float. And that's because those hydrogen bonds have been fixed into the position, so the water molecules are actually further apart. And you can see that when you look at the formation of ice if it's a really cold day. Now, not only is the cohesive property of water, the high specific heat capacity, the high heat of vaporization, the high heat of fusion, there's also what's known as the adhesive property of water. Now that is where there's an attraction of water to other materials, such as the xylem vessel, or such as the material, in this case, on the outside of a bamboo stick. So what you therefore can see is that the adhesive property is where the water is sticking to another material, but we also have the cohesive property where the water is sticking to another water molecule. So what happens then is if you look at a liquid on, for example, a drop of rain on a leaf, you can see the cohesive property making these drops of rain, but also what you see is that the water will actually flow as one. So it can be broken apart if there's enough force to break the hydrogen bonds, which is why I had the two bubbles. But now as it flows as one. Now, the effects of the cohesive property and adhesive property, so cohesion and adhesion, results in what's known as the capillary action. So the movement of the liquid in a very narrow space against the force of gravity is what we know as capillary action. And that's what we see traveling up through the xylem vessel when we look at the transpiration of water. And I have done a video on transpiration, so do please check that one out. What we've also got is the solvent property then. With the solvent property, what we can see is that water can dissolve polar molecules, solutes, due to its polarity. Now that therefore makes water a fantastic transport medium. So because of its solvent property, it can dissolve these polar molecules. It therefore allows for ionic compounds to separate. Now, remember, ionic compounds, going back to GCSE chemistry here, if something is ionic, it means that it has donated its electrons or it has gained electrons. So if we're looking at a cation, for example, the cation becomes positively charged because it has donated its electrons. The anions have become negatively charged because they've gained electrons. So ionic compounds can actually be separated and then can be transported through water due to the fact that they have this polarity. So that positive side of the water will attract the negatively charged anions, and the negative side of the water molecule will attract the positively charged cations. So therefore it allows for ionic compounds to be separated and then allows for them to be transported. Now if it's in plants, we're talking about potentially the apoplast pathway or the symplast pathway. Again, do check out my video on that. If we're talking about in the xylem, we're talking about transpirational stream. If we're talking about the phloem, we're talking about the translocation. And if we're talking about animal and plant responses, then we're talking about hormones. So hormones can be in plants, so that would be in module 5. Do check out that video. Or it could be us talking about the blood plasma and the transport of substances in animals. So that solvent property is another property which makes water a very unique substance for transporting substances. But not only do we have this solvent property that it dissolves and can be a transport medium, we also have to think about just the medium for metabolic reactions. So the cytosol, the cell cytoplasm, has to have the ability to dissolve polar molecules, because basically that's what cytoplasm is. Cytoplasm is made mainly of water and it needs to dissolve these substances in it for the metabolic reaction. If we're looking at the stroma inside the chloroplast, then that as well has metabolic reactions occurring and therefore needs that solvent property of water. The mitochondrial matrix, another fluid which therefore needs to be able to dissolve substances into it. Another part of the solvent property is the fact that it's actually very important for diluting toxic substances. So ammonium ions, urea, you'll learn about them when you look at the module 5 topic of excretion. The water property, the fact that it's solvent, it can dissolve polar molecules, allows for it to dilute very toxic substances. So water is a very important biological molecule that you need to understand those properties of how it can be useful within a plant and within an animal. But it's important to note that there's also some other things about, for example, water and its properties. So the cohesive property of water means that it has a surface tension. So you saw the water droplet before. Well, that water droplet is important for the carrying of pathogens, for example, when we look at communicable diseases. Also, pond skaters can actually live on the surface of water due to the surface tension. So the fact that the cohesive properties are stronger than the properties of water attracted to air, therefore means that some organisms can actually live quite freely on the surface without breaking through. So they've not got enough force to break the hydrogen bonds and therefore penetrate into the water body, and therefore they live on that surface. So what we also need to understand is that water is actually transparent, and because it's transparent, it allows for light to penetrate through. So therefore aquatic plants that live in the water can still photosynthesize because the water is able to penetrate through, and therefore they can absorb the wavelengths of light. So you do need to bring in a bit of GCSE knowledge here when it comes to the topic on photosynthesis, and I'll talk about that more later on. But it's important to note that water is a medium that allows light to penetrate. But remember, if light is moving from one medium, i.e. air, into another, water, there is going to be diffraction occurring here. So if you like this video, then please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. Also, if you haven't already, do check out my revision platform, www.aiqchat.com. It is there to help you to revise, to identify your strengths and your weaknesses, and there is access to an AI tutor.